Hey, Kurt Snyder here, back with episode 6 now of the Backcountry Bike Repair series. And episode 5 was part 1 of shifting difficulties. This is going to be part 2 of that. And in that last episode, we talked about what to do if your chain isn't shifting smoothly up and down the cassette, and talked all about how the shifter and the cable and housing and the derailleur all interact to make that happen, and how to adjust the tension on the cable accordingly. Today, we're going to take it one step farther with, okay, that didn't solve the issue you're having. What can we look at and how can we address it for the next level of complications? So we're going to start with Kait demystifying again, kind of how this all works together, and then walk through a few different types of shifting difficulties that go beyond just the smoothness of the shifting to, like, what if your chain is falling off?
So for today's episode, we are in the Palisades, which are my backyard. My house that we just built is right over there in Teton Valley. And we are up on my favorite trail amongst the wildflowers, and it's my birthday. And one of the things I'm excited about today is that now that well, not because I'm 38, but I am now 38, and I, for the first time in my life, can truly explain how a drivetrain works, which is very exciting because that's what we are here to do today. So the point of that is really just that they are complicated, and it is easy to approach drivetrain issues with just trying to throw the kitchen sink of turning things and twisting things and pulling on things to try to figure it out. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Oftentimes when we just randomly turn things, if it does work, we don't even know why or like what led it to work. So going back to the basics of like understanding how a drivetrain works leads us to then being able to actually understand what is causing the symptoms that we are experiencing. So some of this is going to be reviewing what we went over in the last episode, but for more of the explanation around how cable tension actually affects shifting, go review that episode. Because now we'll go through demystifying the drivetrain continued. So starting with anatomy, we have our shifter. We have a barrel adjuster on our shifter, and they're generally 2 paddles. We have our housing, and inside the housing is a cable, which you can't see until the end. These days, that tends to go through a frame. It might be routed externally to the frame. And then down in the middle, we have a crankset that is the drive side crank. Here has a spindle that goes through the bottom bracket, which allows the cranks to spin in the frame of the bike. On this drive side crank, we have a chainring. If this was a 2-speed or even 3-speed drivetrain, we would have a front derailleur and multiple chainrings, but this is a 1-speed, 1-by. And so there's 1 chainring. And then the chain connects back to our cassette. And that back here, after the chainring and chain, we have our cassette. Cassettes can have a number of different cogs. These days, a lot of drivetrains have 12-speed cassettes, but they could be 11 or 10 and so on. It's just worth knowing how many you have, because that is very dependent on the rest of your drivetrain as well. One thing to note, just kind of lingo language wise, is that when talking about which gears you're in or which cogs, the top of the cassette are our low speeds. And the way I remember that is like low and slow. You know, when you're in your granny gear, your biggest gear, you're in your lowest gear going the slowest. And then these are the high gears here on our tiny ones. And I think of that as like when I'm driving a manual vehicle, which also shows that I'm 38 years old. That if I was like in the 5th gear, I'd be going the fastest. And so the high ones are the hardest ones. And that just helps us talk about what's going on with our shifting, is being able to say, well, in the high gears or in the low gears. So the high gears are down here, the low gears are up here. And I know that is very confusing and backwards. And then from our cassette, we have the kind of connection over to the derailleur. So we're going to talk about the derailleur, but first there are a couple things going on that could impact shifting and anatomy wise with your bike. First, we have our axle and how our wheel is attached to our frame. This is a through axle, and that is very common these days, but there are also quick release style, and that would be relevant sometimes in different shifting issues based on how like the cassette could be seated in the frame. And then we also have how the derailleur attaches to the bike. And there is a derailleur hanger, which is its own part, and that is from here down to here, and then the derailleur is thread into the hanger, and the hanger is thread or pushed into the frame. And what those do is they allow the derailleur in an ideal world to get hit and the hanger would bend, and then you can easily replace the hanger, the quite inexpensive part, an easy to replace part, and still have an intact and functioning derailleur. That's the ideal world, and that is the purpose of the hanger, rather than the derailleur just being affixed straight to the frame. So then we want to look at the derailleur, and again, understanding the derailleur helps us understand why it may not be doing what we want it to do. So, anatomy bits, we have the housing coming into the derailleur, and then the cable coming through the derailleur, and this bolt here pinches the cable into the right tension. There are a few screws back here. We'll talk about what they do in a moment. This is the B screw. The B screw basically just sets the distance between the derailleur cage and this pulley and the cassette. And then that impacts how smoothly the derailleur shifts. These are the limit screws, and there is a high limit and a low limit screw, which refers to which direction of the cassette they're adjusting. And so these limit screws really just set the range that the derailleur can move laterally from right, or in the high gears, out to the left in the low gears. And then in the cage here, we have a spring. It's a pretty big spring, and basically that spring is trying to pull the derailleur down into the highest gear. And our cable, and with using the shifter pulling tension on the derailleur, that is what pulls the derailleur into the lower gears. And when we release to shift into high gears again, that is basically just releasing the tension so that the spring can pull the derailleur back into the higher gears. So in here we have another spring, and that spring is controlling this. And so it is basically just allowing the derailleur to take up slack in the chain as the chain moves through the cassette. As you can see, this biggest cog here would take up more chain or require more chain length, whereas the smallest one requires less chain length. And so the derailleur accounts for those differences. And that's one of the...
Now that we have an orientation that Kait gave us to all of these parts, we're going to jump into the diagnostic component of all this. And as you can guess, it can be kind of complicated because there's all these different pieces to the drivetrain, and all of them contribute to how well and smoothly a bike shifts or doesn't. And so as we try to work through what might be causing your shifting woes, I think it's important to think about where those problems could come from. And one, it could be something's out of adjustment. Two, it could be that something's damaged or bent, or maybe coming loose, like a bolt coming loose. Or three, it could be that something is outright broken. We're gonna save the broken part for the next episode. That'll be like, say your derailleur is hanging off the bike, or your chain is dangling and broken. We'll deal with how to fix those obvious things next time. But today we're going to walk through some of the adjustment and other types of diagnostics that can contribute to shifting problems. And something that is really important to think about and can make life a lot easier is think about the context of the shifting problems you're having. Did they just start? Has it been gradually getting worse over time? Did you just crash right over there? And then, something traumatic may have happened to the bike. Or did you just change anything on the bike before this ride or make an adjustment earlier in the ride? All of those can contribute to potential shifting problems. And the way you go through diagnosing what it is relates to what that context might be. So let's start with, really quickly, did you change something on the bike? That could be that, say, you replaced your chain just before the ride, and now your chain is jumping a little bit. It could be that your cassette was fairly worn, your old chain was pretty worn, and when you put a new chain on an old cassette, suddenly it doesn't shift well anymore, or it feels like it jumps when you put force into the pedals. That's a really easy one. The solution, well, you have a new chain and an old cassette. You need to replace your cassette on there. So that could be an easy one. Did you just take your wheel off and put it back on, or have your bike in pieces while you traveled and put it together? One issue that can contribute to shifting problems is if your through axle, the axle actually threads in from this side, but if that's a little bit loose and the wheel can wobble a little bit, that means there's a little bit of play in all of this. That can make your bike shift poorly. So check bolts and check the through axle. I've seen derailleurs start to unthread themselves a little bit, and as the derailleur unthreads itself, the derailleur moves relative to the cogs. That can contribute to shifting issues. So think about anything that might have changed. Check everything, all the bolts on here, to make sure that they're all snug, and then start to proceed with some other potential diagnostics. Did you just crash? Were you coming down this descent right over here and end up in the weeds and go over the bars? If so, there's a lot of things that can happen to a bike when it gets thrown through the bushes or over rocks, or even just twists in an awkward slow speed fall. So first thing is, look to see, is there anything that's obviously bent or broken on there? A common one is if the derailleur impacts the ground or a rock or something like that, the whole cage, this lower part of the derailleur, can get bent, or the hanger can get bent. And so if you get behind the bike, like I'm looking from the back end right here and looking to see that the plane that the derailleur cage sits in here, and the plane of these cassettes, and the plane of the chain and the wheel, all of that should be roughly parallel. If you look down and see the derailleur is bent like way in like that, that's a bad sign. And that probably means that either the derailleur cage down here got bent, or the hanger right here got bent. And if you're out on a ride, you can try two things. One, you can gently try to pry that back and unbend it so it's a little bit straighter. It's a little bit risky to do that. You can also do the same here, literally just pull on the whole derailleur and try to straighten out the hanger a little bit. I've had to do that many times on rides. You can also just ride gingerly. If you're close to a trailhead, almost done with your ride, just like leave it be. Don't try to shift into either end of the cog, because that might cause the chain to fall off. And just kind of nurse it out and deal with it later. Other things that can get damaged in a crash. It's really common that the cable housing right here could get caught on something and pulled out, bent, damaged, crimped. So you can inspect that, and also inspect the cable up here where it comes out of the shifter. Make sure that the barrel adjuster where it goes into the shifter is intact. It's not broken off right here. Shouldn't have any play in that. Make sure the shifting is intact, or the shifter is intact. And if you do find any damage in there, that's an obvious sign that can be contributing to shifting issues. Another symptom, your chain is falling off. And this can be the most infuriating thing ever, especially if it just keeps happening again and again. And the chain can fall off here, it can fall off here, it can fall off up here. Different places, different symptoms, different solutions to all that. If the chain is falling off either this side of the cassette and going into the spokes, which can damage the spokes and the chain can like completely jam in there, or if the chain is falling off down here next to the smallest cog, that's usually related, well, it's always related to derailleur alignment. And it could be that, one, you crashed, bent something, and now the chain is able to fall off. Or Kait mentioned these limit screws earlier. it could be that those are out of adjustment. And what these limit screws, again, as Kate explained, do is they control how far this way and how far this way the derailleur can go. And so they really are just stops. And if the high limit screw, usually they have a little tiny H or L next to them. If the high limit screw is turned too far out, that will let the chain go, the derailleur move too far this way and the chain will fall off that way. Same thing on this one. If the limit screw for the low end is unthreaded or threaded too far out that way, the chain will go into the spokes. So if you're having the issue with the chain falling off one of these places, first thing to check, does everything look straight? If everything looks straight, nothing's obviously bent, then it probably is that the limit screws are just a little out of adjustment. When adjusting these limit screws, ideally you're doing it with the cable loosened, like not actually clamped in the bolt, because the cable can control how far the derailleur moves also. But since we're in the scenario that you're out on the trail and the chain is falling off, we're just going to find the low limit screw right here for the scenario where the chain is going in the spokes. And that is this limit screw here. And if you watch right here, as I turn the screw, you'll see the pulley move relative to, oops, sorry, wrong one, this one. You can see the derailleur moving left to right there relative to the cog. And so if the chain is falling off, if it's going in here, what we want to do is move that limit screw so that the pulley can't move quite as far in the direction of the spokes. So I'm going to turn the limit screw in a little bit, and we go to there, and then try it. See if that solves the problem. And same thing if the chain was falling off on the inside right here by the smallest cog, then we would turn that other limit screw a little bit in and limit how far the derailleur can move in that direction. So that's basic limit screw adjustment on the trail. And you can also, in the reverse, if you aren't able to shift into one of those other gears, it could be a limit screw issue. And so I would check by just turning a limit screw a little bit, see if you back it out, does that let the derailleur move farther? Or is maybe something else contributing to not letting the derailleur move as far as it should be? What if the chain is falling off on the front? On these single chainring setups, it's a lot less common than it used to be with multiple chainrings and a front derailleur that can screw things up if poorly adjusted. Usually, if the chain keeps falling off in the front, something is bent or damaged or worn out. And a super common cause of it is either a bent tooth or a bent chainring. This is one that I was riding with. You can see right here how bent that part of the ring is. This is one I was riding with last week and smashed into a rock quite hard, bent this way out of shape, and the chain would fall off every time I went around one pedal revolution. The solution to that? Well, I smashed the chainring, which way did it go? It got bent outward when I hit the rock, and so I found a smaller rock and just gently smashed that way a few times and straightened it enough that chain stayed on just fine, and I was able to keep going and finish that ride. It can also happen if you bend an individual tooth, and sometimes that tooth then is pushing the chain off every time the chain tries to move across it. And so that's another one. The solution, usually a rock, or use a couple rocks, is like hold one against the tooth and then smash with another rock and try to straighten out the tooth as best as possible.
Sometimes you're just pedaling along and your drivetrain starts skipping or grinding or jumping. And one of the notable things about it is that it's doing that no matter what gear you're in and no matter how you try to tune your shifting. And so that symptom is, one, really annoying and is often related to parts of your drivetrain being damaged or worn out. So again, you can go back through what Kurt was talking about of like, what has happened recently? Was there a crash? Did you hit something, like pedal strike and like bang your chainring over a rock? Or have you just been riding this drivetrain on a 3,000-mile bikepacking trip and things are slowly starting to get more grindy and skippy? So a couple different parts that we want to think about would be if the drivetrain feels like it's grinding through the chain ring. And when you either get off and assess, or someone riding next to you can see, as you spin the cranks, you want to be looking at how the chain is releasing from the bottom of the chain ring. And sometimes this shouldn't happen because this is all quite new and in good condition, but the chain ring will actually stay, or the chain will stay hung up on the chain ring and release late. And you can see, rather than it just coming smoothly off the bottom of the chain ring, it's hanging up and then creating this kind of little arc and dropping down. And that means that your chain ring is worn. The reason for that is that when chain rings wear, they create kind of a wave shape tooth profile, that in that arch in the tooth can just grab the chain as it's trying to release. Unfortunately, that means you need a new chain ring, but if you don't have one on hand, the best thing you can do to kind of get that to the next opportunity to replace your chain ring is just to keep your chain really well lubricated. And so that will mean lubricating the chain a lot more frequently, and keeping it really clean as well, just to really encourage that release. When we have skipping in the drivetrain, that is coming what feels like every pedal stroke, again, no matter what gear you're in, you want to try to figure out if there's something wrong with the chain. Obviously, the chain isn't fully broken because it's spinning, but you can just get off, spin your cranks backwards, and as you go through a full pedal rotation, you're trying to see if the chain is moving smoothly through the pulleys. And when you have a stiff link or damage to the chain, the skip is going to be noticeable through the pulleys. And so that will help you zoom in and identify that damaged link or part of the chain. And that's just the best way to see that. And then to think about what could have happened to our chains, that the chain could have also gotten smashed on a rock from the chain ring. Something could have happened to it in a crash. If you had recently had to add a quick link or do something to your chain, you could end up with some links that aren't quite running smoothly. So a stiff link would look like this, where normally the plates and pins move smoothly and are very flexible. These stiff ones don't really move. And so you can just see how if the chain isn't going to just effortlessly bend around something, like this one won't, that it would move through a cassette, the pulleys, and a chainring really awkwardly and cause jumping or skipping. So that's a stiff link. We're basically trying to open up space here when we fix it. And so there are chain tools like in a shop that will have the element of the chain tool that can address a stiff link. Out in the field, we can just really try to create space by kind of yarding back and forth. And you can see that improved it a bit. I could keep doing that if I wanted to get it even better. And that's where there's just compression from that pin. Here you can see this part of this chain got mangled by a rock. And so there is damage to these plates where they come together by the pin. This one, there's actual damage to the plates, and so that's a little harder to fix. It's at least diagnosing the problem. Could be an opportunity to try to replace part of your chain if you're on a long trip and had a little strip of chain that you could fully just replace a little section, or get a new chain. In this episode, we have talked about all sorts of different scenarios around when things don't work quite right. And in our next episode, we're going to talk about what happens when parts of our drivetrain just straight up break, like our chains or our derailleurs. And when we're out in the field, when we don't have just a brand new chain or a brand new derailleur, what do we do to take a fairly seemingly catastrophic failure to make it pedalable to get you to the next bike shop or back home, no matter how far that is.